afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the next webinar in our series, Bringing Data to Life. My name is Eleanor, and I work at the Office for National Statistics. Thank you for joining us today for our beginners webinar on international migration statistics. Before we start, we'd like to remind you all that the webinars in this series is recorded and will be available on YouTube after the event. The slides and recordings for our previous webinars are now available on the ONS website and YouTube. Everyone signed up to this webinar today will receive a link once today's recording is available. You will also receive an email this afternoon with links of any tools and articles that we mentioned throughout the presentation. If you are using the Microsoft Teams app and you would like to turn on live captions, please click the More button across the top of your screen. For those who haven't used this before, it's the button with 3 dots to the left of your camera button. Once you click More, scroll down to Languages and Speech, and you'll be able to select Show Live options. The chat function, I've jumped a bit. The chat function is closed, but we welcome questions through Slido, and I'll explain that in just a moment. The webinar series is for everyone, so please share this by using the hashtag Statistics for the Public Good. Lastly, you will be invited to a short survey at the end of the presentation, and we welcome your feedback on the webinar series and statistics we produce at the ONS. So the session today is interactive with some questions for you, and there'll be around a 15 to 20-minute Q&A section after the presentations. Please join in by scanning the QR code on your screen or heading over to slido.com and using the code BTDL Migration. If you're using the desktop Microsoft Teams app, you can click the S Slido button at the top of your screen and Slido will appear. The Slido code will appear on every slide, so don't worry if you miss it. I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today. We're joined by Chris Stickney from the ONS. Chris will explain who is a long-term migrant, trends over time in emigration data and revisions. We're also joined by our external speaker, Ben Brindle from the Migration Observatory. Ben will describe how the Migration Observatory, based at the University of Oxford, use ONS data to undertake their analysis, and today specifically looking into labour market outcomes. Thank you very much, and I'll now hand over to Chris.
That's great. Thanks, Eleanor. And welcome, everyone. My name is Chris Stickney. I'm a statistician at the Office for National Statistics. I'm going to talk you through a bit about migration statistics here, some of the trends, as Elle said, and how we produce those stats. So before I really begin, what do we mean when we say a long-term migrant? Well, when we talk about migration statistics, we're often referring to someone who's here for 12 months or more. And that's the UN definition of what we mean by a long-term international migrant. So as they say, it's a person who moves to the country other than that of his or her usual residence for a period of at least a year, so that the country or destination effectively becomes his or her new country of usual residence. Now, that's really important because we want to be able to compare our statistics with the rest of the globe, but also that forms the basis of what our population estimates are. It's right to know where people reside regularly, so that way service provision, for example, can be provided in the right areas. So in 2023, the UK population was about 68 million. And when we say that, what we're referring to is the usual resident population. So in other words, those who usually reside in the UK. Migration clearly plays an important part for population as well. Well, I'm going to tell you a bit about some trends over time, over the next few slides. Historically, migration had been quite stable. If you look at the bottom left, the dark blue bar on the chart, if you like, migration was slowly increasing, net migration over time, but well before December 2012. For example, the accession of Romania and Bulgaria into the EU in 2007, Poland in 2004 as well, opened up many opportunities for migration, particularly from the EU into the UK. That continued to increase up until the Brexit referendum. Net migration reached about 320,000 up to that point. It fell immediately after the Brexit referendum, not necessarily because of a policy change, but because of other factors which caused the fall in net migration. However, you saw a recovery from non-EU nationals, in particular, around December 2018, 2019. But then, of course, we had the 2020 pandemic, where net migration nearly fell flat, maybe about a net number of about 35,000 or so. That was largely because of a slight fall in immigration, but also continuing rise of emigration, particularly EU nationals who began to leave not just for the pandemic, but of course, because as we moved into the new immigration system, it was also the end of the EU transition period. So although it was the end of the transition period, and certainly EU migration, which I'll explain later, began to fall, net migration actually recovered quite considerably after the pandemic. Some of that was around pent-up demand and an economic recovery, but also the new immigration system made visas far more accessible to the wider globe. People could travel, including dependents, and making it more attractive for migration, and therefore you saw net migration climb quite considerably, again, particularly outside the EU. On the next slide, I can tell you a bit more about different nationalities. Now, we group our nationalities into EU or EU plus, as you can see on here, non-EU plus, and British nationals. That plus just represents a few extra countries because of that freedom of movement that they had, similar to the EU. What you can see on this chart is EU net migration dominated migration up to the EU referendum. Non-EU nationals, whilst were considerable, they kind of cancelled out British net emigration. Then the Brexit referendum meant EU nationals, whilst continued to contribute to net migration, began to fall. And then once the end of the transition period happened around January 2021, you had a net outflow of EU nationals, as you can see on the chart with that bluish bar on the right-hand side. The British blip is actually more likely a methodological blip after the census when we changed how we started to look at British nationals. But what's the big story on this chart is that non-EU nationals, following the introduction of the new immigration system, saw a significant rise in immigration, particularly those who came to study or come to work. And the next slide goes into some of that detail. So here you can look at non-EU nationals who've immigrated into the UK by their study type. At the moment, we focus it just on non-EU nationals because of the ability for freedom of movement for British nationals, of course, but also for some EU nationals. But for non-EU nationals, we can see the vast majority of the increase that we saw over the last couple of years was due to work and study related visas. The new immigration system meant there was an expansion of health and care worker visa, for example. There was the ability to bring in dependents and a number of other factors which drove in a significant number of migrants from outside of the EU for work and study related visas. You can also see an increase in the humanitarian visas in 2022. That's most certainly driven by the war in Ukraine, but not exclusively. We also saw a number of people come around that time from Hong Kong and also Afghan nationals, which of course is in the news at the moment. Other visa types like asylum have been stable over the last couple of years, as has family and other visa types as well. More recently, you can see a fall in work and study related visas, where they previously had risen for the last few years since the pandemic. That more recent falls because of tighter government restrictions. There are fewer work dependents we're seeing because of the restrictions on visas for dependents, and more increased salary thresholds, meaning you have to earn more to apply for a skilled worker visa, for example. So the combination means we're seeing a fall in work-related visas or people immigrating for those visas. Similar for study, you're seeing a fall in those who've come to study and bring dependents. Right, we're going to do a poll for you all. As you heard from Eleanor, it's on Slido. The link or the QR code is on your screen as well. I'm curious what you think about what documentation we need in the ONS to know if someone is a long-term migrant. So have a play, any words you can think of, or ultimately what sort of data sources might we need when we want to estimate whether someone's a long-term migrant. And of course, no surprise that word visa has come up very quickly as the predominant word, which is of course a really useful source of information, because then not only do we know what type of people travel, what type of visa, but we also have more confidence about how long they plan to stay. But look how many other words are coming up. You're right, national insurance number. I'll tell you a bit more about how we use NINOs, or national insurance numbers. Passports and passport swipes, of course, are hugely helpful, but also quite challenging because of the number of passport swipes in a single year. This is fascinating. I think you guys need to do my job. Yes, a lot of employment information as well. This is Elle's way of telling me I have to move on, but that slide alone was quite interesting. You're right. There's a lot of admin sources that we can use, and indeed that is the answer. It takes many sources of data for us to robustly estimate long-term international migration, and I'm going to tell you a bit about that. So on one of the previous slides, I talked about nationality being split largely into non-EU, EU, and British. That's also because of the way we use the data to produce the estimates for these nationalities. So for non-EU, the predominant way people immigrate or into the UK is via a visa. Not a Visa or MasterCard visa, but a visa to permit them to travel to the UK. But we don't just use the visa on its own. The Home Office publish visa data. And of course, it's an indicator of whether someone plans to travel here. But some people don't end up traveling on their visa. So we link it to their actual travel patterns. Some people might apply for a short-term visa, but then they apply for another one and another one. And those short-term visas sum up to over 12 months becoming a long-term migrant. Again, all that data is linked together so we can be confident whether someone's here for the long term or not. Likewise, people might come on a long-term visa, but they maybe only use half of that period of time and leave, for example, after 6 months or whatever it may be, and therefore they're not a long-term migrant. I'll tell you a bit about how we make assumptions a bit later, but ultimately it's not just the visa we use, we link it to their travel patterns. For EU nationals, as of course we'd recently had the Brexit referendum and then the new immigration system, many EU nationals do need visas to travel now, but many have EU settlement status, meaning they can travel freely in and out of the UK using the EU settlement scheme, and therefore it's not as easy for us to just make an assumption about whether they plan to be here long term or not. We are working on methods, though, using EU settlement scheme data to tell us whether someone has a right to travel here and then linking that to their travel patterns. So we're hoping to roll that out later this year. For British nationals, it's actually one of the harder nationalities to capture in terms of whether they long-term immigrate or emigrate. And that's because of the amount of passport swipes you get from British nationals in the country in a year. I mean, people go for holidays, for example. So we use the International Passenger Survey. This is what we used to actually estimate all migration up until the point of the pandemic, where we've moved over to a number of admin sources to give us a better measure of migration. Like the other nationalities, we're moving over to admin data for British nationals as well to give us a more robust estimate in the future. Okay, why can't we then count people in and out? Well, as you heard, we do have arrival information. We have departure information. We do have information on passport swipes, but we don't for British. And we don't for those who have EU settlement status, meaning they can come freely. And also some people can travel through the common travel area in between, say, Ireland and Northern Ireland or into the rest of the UK, where there is that ability to move freely still. So because of that, what we have to do is use different data sources for different nationalities. The next slide, I think, explains this in a bit more detail. So last year, there were about 132 million arrivals into the UK, 132 million passport swipes, if you like. And the vast majority, of course, depart sometimes a day later, sometimes even the same day. So over 250 million people come in and out of the UK in a year. And yet less than 1 million we estimate to be long-term immigrants. So it's so important that we get that estimate right. If we had the margin of error even slightly wrong on those 250 million movements in and out, we would get migration wrong. So we look for those long-term routes to give us confidence in our estimates, such as visas linked to travel patterns, so we know people have traveled on it, such as visa extensions. I've talked to you about the work we're doing on EU settlement scheme data. When we link that to travel patterns, again, we'll be more confident that the person is coming here for the long term. Or some people will apply for citizenship or claim asylum or travel under humanitarian routes. These all give us greater confidence that they are a long-term migrant, particularly once it's linked to their travel patterns. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide. So we can produce estimates using admin data, but as I told you on one of the first slides, we follow that long-term migration definition. This is where someone comes for 12 months or more. Our estimates are actually published only 5 months after the reference period, well before someone can become a long-term immigrant or emigrant. So we make assumptions at the time of the publication. These assumptions are based on past behaviors. So we don't know what a person's future behavior might be like, or a group of people's future behavior. It may be driven by global factors. It could be driven by new policies that the UK introduces, the government, the change in the economy, or whatever it may be. So we have to constantly look at those assumptions and those behaviors to make sure we're continuing to get estimates right for the future. So does it mean we've got migration estimates wrong? The next slide touches on some of that. So what you've got here is sort of an approach to how we estimate migration. We look at those past behaviors about whether someone, on how many people, for example, who travel on a long-term visa actually stay for the long term, or how many people who've left the country are just leaving for a holiday or have actually left for the long term. So we make assumptions based on those past behaviors. Then we look at current behaviors to see if those have changed, and we can apply revisions to our previous estimates. The table you can see below are the revisions we made in our May release for the year ending June 2024. So once we had a year of data, we increased immigration by about 23,000 for non-EU nationals and increased immigration by about 12,000. And for EU, it was flat. However, sometimes the revisions are larger, or behaviors have changed quite dramatically since the pandemic. So whilst it's quite interesting to look at those changes of behaviors and the way migration is changing, it also leads to many challenges to how we estimate migration. Okay. These changing patterns of behavior, as I said, have been driven by things like the COVID pandemic, the new immigration system, where people at one point, for example, could bring in dependents and now couldn't. That changes their behavior of whether they plan to stay in the country or not, or how long they stay for. Different countries are coming into the UK, and that does change over time, particularly since the new immigration system. And we show some of that information in terms of when we publish our statistics to give you some of that insight. Again, it makes it a challenge for us to estimate whether they plan to stay long term or not. Salary thresholds, the new graduate route visa was a challenge where we saw a change of behaviors when people came to study. Many began to stay after applying for the graduate route visa because they were able to work for a couple of years after their study. That changed behaviors of students. So when you factor all that in, that does become the question of do we get migration right when we have to make revisions? The next slide touches on that. Does it mean we got it wrong? We always want to provide users with the most timely estimates we can. And you can see from the chart on the right-hand side, we do have to make revisions. We slightly revised immigration, which end immigration and therefore net migration. But that doesn't mean it's not important to give users those timely estimates. It's not that it's wrong, it's that we don't have the data or the information to see whether someone truly has emigrated for 12 months or emigrated for 12 months. So the revisions can be driven by waiting for that complete data. They can also be driven by method changes as well. So what I haven't touched on is if we introduce a new method, which we are looking at for EU nationals, for example, that can also lead to revisions where the method might show us that actually the trend is slightly higher or lower than what we've been estimating. Either way, we want to continue to be transparent, though, to the public about those revisions, why we make them and how we make them. Finally, how do we estimate migration at a local level? It's really important that we don't just give a national picture, because local authorities need to know where the migrants are living or they're leaving, so that way they can adjust their provision. That way schools can plan higher or lower cohorts for the next year, for example, hospitals, education, whatever it may be. So on the left-hand side, once we produce that long-term migration figure for the year that we're confident in, we then need to disaggregate it into groups so that way we can be confident where they're living. That's where we use multiple data sources. For children, for example, we use health data. The NHS captures information about whether someone had lived overseas and therefore applied for a National Health Service record. Whilst we don't use the NHS data on its own to give us information about migrants, it's a useful source to how we distribute them across local authorities. Students, we know that higher education and HESA data capture information about international students and where they live. We don't use it as an individual source to estimate migration, but what we do is we use it to distribute them across the country, because we can use the source in terms of having rich information about where international students live. Finally, adults. Adults almost all contribute either through the tax and benefits system. And so therefore, if you're paying a tax or receiving a benefit, we have information on whether you've applied for a national insurance number from overseas, so we know which migrants are from overseas, where they are living, and therefore we can distribute adults across the country as well. And that point I mentioned about students, of course, some students are indeed contributing to the economy. They might be working part-time or whatever. We have methods where we link data together to tell us where those students are as well, so we're not double counting, for example. So that gives you a picture of how we divide migrants into the various local authorities. And that, of course, contributes to population change in each of those LAs, so they can then plan the right provision for their local authorities, and of course, how we adjust for population every year. And I'm going to pass to Ben, though, who's going to talk a bit more about how Migration Observatory use our data. Thanks. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, right. So I'm going to talk through how we use ONS data in our analysis, but I guess a first thing to explain is actually who the Migration Observatory are. So that's should be on the next slide. So what we do, we provide evidence-based analysis of data, both on migration and migrants in the UK. And crucially, we are impartial. So we don't make policy recommendations. There isn't a particular vision that we have. What we want is for facts and evidence to be present in the migration debate. And there are several ways that we go about doing that. So we have a website and we publish briefings and commentaries, and they cover everything from international students across to small boat arrivals, really the whole spectrum of the migration discussion. We speak to the media as well, both on popping up on TV and radio. You might well have seen us. And we also speak to journalists as well when they are writing articles too. And last but of course not least, we also go to events, those hosted by policymakers, and events just like this one as well. So what are some of the ONS sources that we use in our briefings and our commentaries? Well, there's a range of things, and some of these are quite fundamental, such as, for example, where migrants living in the UK are from. So we should be able to see this. Yeah. So in 2021 and 2022, 16% of the UK population was born outside of the UK. And the ones that you can see on your screen were the most common non-UK countries of birth. And actually about a third of that 16% come from 5 countries. So come from India, from Poland, Pakistan, Romania, and from Ireland as well. So that's where migrants living in the UK have come from. But we also know as well the reason that migrants first came to the UK as well. But I'm going to pass that one over to you to have a guess and see what you think first. So this is essentially, if we spoke to every migrant living in the UK and said, why did you first come to the UK? What do you think their answer would be? So we've got work as the most common at the moment. Really quite far ahead, actually, 2/3. Okay, yeah, there's very much a common answer here that people are going for. Very interesting. You see, oops, okay, all right, studies coming back a little bit. This is maybe not quite as close a race as I thought it might be, but okay, I think there is a pretty dominant answer. The majority of you are saying work. We've got study, family, and other after that. But actually, what's really quite interesting is that in 2022, the most common reason that migrants living in the UK had come to the UK was to join family. Now, I should clarify that this is a slightly different definition of family to that in the migration statistics that Chris was talking about. So, for example, if somebody comes to the UK on a work visa, their partner would be counted as a work migrant in the net migration data. But here, it's actually a reported survey, so they would likely say family. So it's slightly different there. But I still think it's quite surprising because work migration and study migration are quite big drivers of immigration and a big reason that people come to the UK. The reason we get the picture that we see here, where 44% of migrants living in the UK in 2022 came for family reasons, is that although that's a smaller part of the reason people come to the UK, those people are more likely to stay as well. So it's not just the immigration that's important here, but the emigration that is as well. But I certainly didn't know that until I'd first looked at our briefing. I have to say, I was really quite surprised. So then that's looking at the stock of migrants living in the UK. Had a look at this chart already, but I'm going to touch on it as well because it's so important. And the reason it's so important, as Chris was mentioning, is that it doesn't just look at immigration, it looks at emigration as well. And that's a really important part of the migration picture. Just to give you an example of how that's been really important in our work, we've noticed that post-Brexit that an increasing number of international students have been staying in the UK. Those emigration figures weren't as high as we expected that they might be. And this was an interesting pattern, seeing that change in behaviour, and we wanted to understand why. And when we dug around looking at some other sources, we found that it wasn't just the fact that international students were moving on to the graduate route, the post-study work route that lets them live and work in the UK for 2 to 3 years. There were also a significant number of international students moving onto a long-term work visa directly, and quite a significant portion of those people were moving into the care sector, which doesn't naturally line up with what you expect when you think about international students and undergraduate degrees and master's degrees. And so that was a really interesting pattern that we were first sort of noticed and followed up as a result of the net migration data. Yeah, I think it's really quite interesting. It's not just that though, it's not just about who's coming to the UK and who's living in the UK. We can understand a bit more as well about what migrants are doing as well. So I think we have another question for you now. Yes. So which occupations do you think had the highest proportion of migrant workers and non-UK born workers in 2024? In other words, which occupations are most reliant on migration? So we've got care work and health professionals are the most common at the moment. Factory workers lagging behind a little bit, but okay, about 2/3 saying care. Yeah. Okay, this is sense so far. Okay. Very few people saying factory workers or IT professionals. Lots of people on the line going for care and health professionals, and that has been a key reason that people have come to the UK on work visas recently. Okay, right. Okay, so that come through. It's actually a slight trick question. It depends whether we are looking at EU migrants or non-EU migrants. So for EU migrants, the occupations that are most reliant on them are, at least at the very top, are more manual tasks such as factory work. Then for non-EU migrants, healthcare jobs, including care work, are the most common. I mean, there's quite a bit of range here for both EU and non-EU workers in terms of the occupations that are most reliant. But I think that broadly this reflects the migration rules that have been in place up until recently for EU and non-EU workers. So up until the end of 2020, EU citizens could come to the UK under free movement, didn't have to meet skill or salary requirements to get a job. But for non-EU workers, they either, if they came on a work visa, had to meet these skill and salary requirements, which were quite high. It was restricted to graduate level jobs, or they could come on different types of visa, such as a family visa to join a partner in the UK, where they could work in any job. And so we get sort of an overrepresentation towards the top of the skill distribution and the bottom as well. What an interesting picture. We can look the other way as well, though, about the trajectories of migrants in the labour market, depending on the reason that they came to the UK. So I don't think it's that surprising that people who came to the UK for work were the most likely to be in employment in 2023. It's also perhaps not too surprising that at the other end, people who came to the UK initially to seek asylum were the least likely to be employed in 2023. But why is that? There's actually quite a range of reasons that have meant that people who came seeking asylum are less likely to be employed. Covers education levels, language ability, but also factors such as the fact that asylum seekers tend to have smaller social networks, and so there's fewer people to say, oh, there's this job that's being advertised, or I can put you in touch with this person. There's less opportunity for that. And then policy is important here as well, because while people are claiming asylum and waiting for that claim to be processed, they can't work, at least for a year, and even then it's quite restrictive after that. And what that means is those people who are granted refugee status and then are allowed to work, there's been some time in a lot of cases that they've been out of the labour market, and that means that it's more difficult to then move into the labour market after that. But another thing that I mentioned was language, and that's important. We can see that on the next slide. So this is a breakdown of labour market activity for the non-UK born by their level of English language proficiency. You can see a very big difference there, that people who say they can't speak English well or can't speak English at all, they are far less likely to be in employment at the time of the census. Now that kind of works two ways, both in that if somebody doesn't have as good English language skills, it's more difficult for them to get a job, but also the fact that the English language requirements for work visas tend to be a bit higher than other types of visa. And so you're sort of controlling for it there, and that people who can't speak English as well, they weren't going to be coming for work anyway. So there's a bit of self-selection. Now that 40% or so that I mentioned who aren't in work or study that can't speak English very well, probably wondering what they are doing. About half of them are looking after the family or looking after their home. That's by far the most common reason that they are not in either work or in study. Okay, so that's the labour market. Just a couple of things slightly different. Housing. I think there are a couple of really interesting things going on here. Firstly, you can see that recent arrivals, people who came to the UK in the past 5 years, they have very high rental rates. About 3/4 of those people are renting privately, and it takes about 20 years before the non-UK born home ownership reaches similar levels to the UK born, and those rental rates decrease to similar levels as well. Another thing which I think is quite interesting here is that the proportion of migrants living in social housing, it's about the same as the UK born, but we can see some differences here, where the longer people have lived in the UK, generally the more likely they are to have to be living in social housing. And this really reflects immigration policy, that people, non-EU migrants and EU migrants as well, who have come since Brexit, they generally can't be allocated social housing. So people on a work visa, family visa, or study visa generally can't get access to social housing. It's only after they apply for indefinite leave to remain, or permanent residence, in other words, that they then can become eligible. And that you need to have been in the UK for 5 years, generally at a minimum. And so that's why we see this picture over time, that people are more likely the more time they've lived in the UK. Okay, so then from housing, it's one last thing for me about crime. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you might have spotted that it's actually, this chart isn't based on ONS data. So why am I including it? Well, the reason is because on its own, this data isn't that much use. It's one thing to know that 12% of Britain population are non-UK nationals, but that doesn't really mean anything unless we know what proportion of the UK population, or the England and Wales population in this case, are non-UK nationals as well. We need something to compare it against to give it context. And so that's exactly what we've done. And what we've seen is that the non-UK proportion of the prison population among the sentence population, so people who have been convicted and given a sentence, migrants are slightly underrepresented in that prison population. But it's very much the opposite when it comes to the on-remand population. So people who are waiting for their trial or who've been convicted but not yet handed a sentence, they are overrepresented in the prison population. And when we had to look into this, we found that there were two really common reasons for that. The first is that it's considered that migrants have a greater risk of absconding. So if we let them out on bail, then they might just they might not come back, essentially. And related to that, there's often less, the data isn't as good on, say, past offending history and other bits of data that are important when making decisions about bail as well. But it's only, as I say, because of the fact that we can compare these shares to the population shares that we can really put that into context and interpret what it means and guide us to try and work out some of the reasons underpinning what we see there. And I think that's all from me on the slides. So I guess just to underpin that, some of the other data sources that we use, the international migration estimates and the large-scale survey data that are presented there, but also we use Home Office visa data and then some other data sources as well, such as HMRC data on employees.
Fab. Thanks so much, Ben, and thanks so much, Chris. Those were great presentations. We've got stacks of time for questions, so we're now going to go over to the Q&A part. If we don't get your question today, then don't worry, you can email engagement.hub@ons.gov.uk and we will answer your question. So let's have a look at some of the questions that we've received. Okay, so the first question is, what is the difference between asylum and humanitarian entrance? Thanks. So that's from Sandra. So Chris, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, humanitarian routes are a specific visa type that we grant to certain countries usually. So the most common one that most of us will be aware of on this call is the one we issue to Ukrainian nationals following the war in Ukraine. Asylum is something that people can claim once they enter the UK and claim for, rather than via a route via, say, Ukraine or something like that. So they are distinguished for that reason. And then there may be certain restrictions under the humanitarian visa, for example. And then asylum is under international law, which if someone's granted it, follows slightly different than a visa. I wouldn't want to go in terms of like legal answer, but yeah, they are distinguished.
Great, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Sandra, for your question. We'll go on to the next one. So how do the statisticians track visa applicants, their patterns, if working with anonymised data and compared with published Home Office data?
Yeah, shall I give a go at that one as well?
Yeah.
Well, we work with anonymized data in terms of any analysis we do on it. There are some data linkages that go on, but our analysts don't tend to see these. These are done via methods where they don't need to see information on a person's name or other linkage variables. Instead, what the analysts do is they look at, once those records are linked, that gives them data sets that they can look at to see what types of nationalities, for example, if people are migrating or how long they're here for. So there are patterns we track, but we don't need, and we don't look at information on people's names, for example. We use that for linkage purposes, but our analysts don't see that. How does it compare with published Home Office data? Home Office publish a lot of data that perhaps isn't always linked. For example, in the case where they issue out visas granted, these are visas that are approved, but people don't always travel on those. But we work very closely with Home Office, and indeed the linkage is sometimes done by Home Office. So they do some of the linkage for us before it comes to us in terms of the visa and whether they traveled on it or not.
Great, thank you, Chris. I'll go to the next one, and Ben, I think this one is for you. So could you tell us a bit more about the changes in migration patterns post-pandemic by country of origin, and why has that changed?
Yeah, absolutely. I think maybe the easiest way to think about this is think about EU and non-EU citizens by reasons for migration. So thinking about non-EU migrants, the two main drivers of net migration since the pandemic has been work and it's been study. That's partly a result of the change in migration policy, that it's now the post-Brexit immigration system is less restrictive to non-EU citizens. But it's also, I think, really important some other things that aren't related to migration policy. So work migration, people coming to join the health and care sector and particularly become care workers has been sort of the main reason that people have come to work. And the reason for that is because there's high vacancy rates in the care sector, and that's because of poor pay and working conditions. So not related to migration policy there. Then with international students, that's been partly a post-pandemic bounce back. People have put off studying abroad. Then also as well, university finances have something of a challenging position now, and so they've more actively recruited international students because they pay higher levels of tuition fees. So these non-migration factors are really important. In terms of where people are coming from, I mean, with student migration, India and Nigeria is where a lot of that growth has come from. I should mention EU migrants as well. I think the main thing there has been the change in the migration system as well, in that before Brexit, it was pretty easy to move across to the UK, didn't have to meet some of the conditions that EU migrants do now, and there's not the admin and visa fees and these sorts of things. And so I think, yeah, it's essentially become a bit more difficult in terms of the logistics, and that's meant that we've had fewer people coming.
Great, thank you, Ben. The next question came in just before your section, Ben, but it is, what is the most popular countries from which immigrants come from? So I don't know if you want to expand a bit more on the chart you've shown or earlier.
I won't add too much to that, just to say that was from a couple of years ago, so that picture is changing over time. As I say, India and Nigeria have been quite big drivers of migration recently, and so I think Nigeria might have moved up. I think it was 6th place on that chart. It might have moved up from there, but I'm not sure quite where those things are. But yeah, it's a picture that's always changing, basically. I think is where I'll leave it.
Great, thank you, Ben. The next question is, what if people don't have a biometric passport or go through immigration via a personal check of passport? Can you capture their info? So
Yes.
Chris, I'll go to you on this one.
Yes, and I think sometimes I give the impression we use passport swipes. What we use is advanced passenger information, which is airlines and I believe sea travel are obliged to collect that information for anyone who travels here. Yes, some people travel, for example, on small boats, but the vast majority, we know that from Home Office, claim asylum. So we have that information as well. So in other words, almost all routes, we do have information on people who travel here. And we can check that and corroborate that using many data sources, and they keep giving us a similar ballpark estimate.
Well, thank you, Chris. The next one's an interesting question. So do you stop being a migrant when you become a British citizen?
That's quite a philosophical one or something. The only thing I will answer before Ben might have a much better view is, for example, in the census, we collect information on your country of birth. Your country of birth will always be a factual thing, where you were born. On your question about citizenship, yeah, there's various ways we can estimate that. I don't know, Ben, if you had a particular view on that.
No, I think it's sort of a similar view. It depends. Often in terms of our analysis, it depends on what data is available. So sometimes country of birth data is what's available, and under that definition, somebody is going to be classified as a migrant, even if they've lived here, most of their life. If it's done on a nationality definition, then that's going to change over time, and it's sometimes based on data availability. I think that we tend to use country of birth when it's available, if there's a choice between the two, because you still get quite an interesting picture. If people have lived in the UK for many years and become a British citizen, there's still something to learn from that. But yeah, they each have their benefits, they each have their drawbacks, and it will depend what's available and quite what you're looking at as well.
Great, thank you both. The next question is there a system that tracks individuals with their visa, criminal history, or received benefits, and all tax or non-tax monetary contributions to the UK?
There are many administrative data systems that we use to estimate population and migration. For example, information on tax and benefits, data linked to when a person applies for national insurance overseas, or for example, when someone applies for a visa and then travels on that link to that advanced passenger information. So there are a number of systems. It is not a single system. We use some of those systems sometimes linked together to give us information on the population, the economy, society, but not I wouldn't describe it as a single system. And again, we use that purely for statistical purposes, not for, to track criminals or any individuals.
Lovely, thanks, Chris. I will go on to the next one, which is, apart from coherence with other statistical systems, why do you not analyse people who come in for less than 12 months, who would surely still use services?
There's a growing interest, I think, in short-term migrants. I'm sure Ben has to face that as well. A few reasons. Firstly, we absolutely recognise that growing need and are actively looking at it. It's important not just for international comparison, but also because typically a usual resident, i.e. someone who is here for the long term, is a useful indicator for how services are planned, and it avoids that double counting if you have a lot of movement back and forth within the country or in and outside the country. So it's important not just for international comparisons, but to plan services. But absolutely, the person who wrote this question is right. You still have to cater for services for the short term. We collected information on that in the census. We are looking at how we can do that using admin data. If you leave a sufficient window, maybe 3 months, then the data is fairly robust to start producing estimates, which I think we're aiming to do. I don't want to give the timeline, but we're looking at that at the moment. But Ben, I'm sure you agree there is an interest in that short-term migration as well.
Yeah, no, I don't have much to add beyond what you said. I completely agree. As you might have slightly different impacts in terms of certain services, but while somebody is here, there are definitely services they are still using.
Great, thank you both. We'll go on to the next one, which is from Porrick, which is, considering migration at a local level, this is much influenced by provision of housing. Is it reasonably possible to factor this into projections? So Chris, I will give you this one.
So we recently published our subnational population projections, which give you that real granular local level. It includes many things that we look into, but it's not a forecast. So if there's a change of policy that has happened very recently, or for example, the new government, and whether that's changing how housing is being built, that might not be observed in the projection, because the projection looks at the long term historically and projects that into the long term. Same with migration. I mean, absolutely, the trends of migration in the past are used to project forward, and we looked very carefully at some most recent changing patterns in migration historically to try and give us the best projections. So if the question is about housing, it's based on long-term patterns. So forgive me if I'm misinterpreting it. If it's in migration, the same, but we look at those most recent patterns as well to give us, particularly in that short run of the projection, the first 5 years or so of it.
Great, thank you, Chris. The next question is from Paul. So is there a period of time that a person must leave the UK to not be classed as a long-term resident?
In terms of how we produce the estimates, yes. The rules are a bit convoluted to make sure we get the best estimate possible, and I believe we publish it. So I think what we look for, and it depends on which admin source, but for example, non-EU nationals, they make up about 86%, I think, of migrants. What we look for is whether they've been out of the country for at least 6 months, and then we therefore assume that they've spent the majority of their time outside of the country for that year, if that makes sense. So I believe it's 6 months is the threshold, but if they travel in and out, we apply certain rules to make sure we're giving the best estimate possible for people who come, perhaps, live in multiple places or whatever.
Great, thank you, Chris. The next one is, whilst migrants might have national insurance numbers, isn't it the case refugees or asylum seekers don't? Does this make it harder?
Assume does that relate to
Ben?
Yeah, does that relate to like the net migration estimates? Because my understanding,
it does.
correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
is based on claims of asylum.
Yes.
Right? And so you're getting a record just by a different method.
Yes.
Not by the go on.
Absolutely. The Home Office will give us information on those people who apply for asylum. We also do a lot of data linkage to make sure we're not double counting across data sources. So I think it's called a migrant worker scan. This is where people apply for a national insurance number from overseas, which is then linked to tax and benefit data. That gives us that information then, not just whether someone's applied for one, but whether we start to see that behavior, the activity, if you like, that people are now contributing either via tax or benefits, that tells us they've probably immigrated. And when all of a sudden those tax and benefits stop on a record, that gives us an indication that they've probably immigrated. And I say probably, we don't always get those estimates right. So we sometimes have to wait, because maybe they just had a blip, a career break or whatever, and they might not have immigrated. So sometimes we have to wait a little while to see. But there are multiple data sources, I think, is my answer to this, to corroborate, to make sure we're not double counting or missing people off. When we looked at the census 2021, for example, recently, it tells us about how many people immigrated in the last year. And you can look at our estimates. They were very comparable. And it also tells us about what the change of population happened over the decade. And once again, our admin-based migration estimates, which was what we use at the moment, were very comparable. So what the admin data told us happened over the decade, the census corroborated.
Great, thank you, Chris. The next one is the new UK visa requirements helping understand movements, or is that too early to say? So it might be for both of you, I think.
You go first, Ben, if you'd like.
Sure, I don't have much to say here. I think from my perspective, it very much is too early to say.
Yeah.
I hope someone puts something together that I can use.
Yes. So as I mentioned earlier in our presentation, our most recent reference period for migration statistics is end of December 2024. We don't produce any forecasts, for example. But quite simply, we absolutely every 6 months take a strong look at what changing patterns are to make sure we are making the right assumptions for the next 6 months or whatever. So there's been many changes to visa policy over the last 5 years or so. And sometimes, whilst maybe more predictable, sometimes not. For example, a good few years ago, when people immigrated shortly after the pandemic, we made assumptions that many would leave. And yet actually the vast majority who immigrated after the pandemic happened stayed, presumably because they knew what they were facing. So in short, no, it's too early to say, but we constantly monitor when the data becomes available.
Yeah, great. Thank you both. I'll go on to the next one. So I think this was in relation to the slide about admin data. So are there published DPIAs? So for anyone who doesn't know, that's a data protection. Oh, Chris, you might have to help me out.
Impact assessment.
That's the one. So
yeah,
for some of the movements, I don't think most people would expect the data to be used in this way.
Yes, I mean, we treat data very sensitively and take it our responsibility as a data custodian very serious. We produce data protection impact assessments wherever we feel that we are handling very sensitive data. We produce these and we make a number of assessments to make sure we're handling the data carefully. In terms of how people would expect the data to be used? I mean, I think it's a good question. Where we hold personal data, we make that available on the ONS website in terms of which data sources those are, so people can see where their data may be held by ONS. People can also register if they're not content for the data to be held, and ONS will look at what they can do about that. So you'd have to make an individual write in individually to ONS about information that ONS holds on you. But yeah, we do not use any data that we hold on any individuals for anything other than statistics or statistical research. And we are not interested in the individual, we're interested in the aggregate that tells us about the economy and society.
Lovely, thank you, Chris. I think we've got time for a few more questions. So the next one is, do you estimate how many people may be subject to modern day slavery and not visible through the normal data sets?
Ben, I'd defer to you if you had a particular view on that.
I don't think there is much data on this, but there is I think a little bit. We've had other colleagues at the Migration Observatory who've had a bit of a look into this. So I don't know anything, but you, Jenny, are more than welcome to get in touch with me, and I can see if I can what information that we have on this. So yeah, I think there is some not necessarily great data out there, but I'm not quite sure what.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks both. I'll go on to Neil's question. So Neil asks, is there any evidence to indicate whether long-term international migrants, particularly more recent arrivals, were undercounted in Census 2021?
I don't think there's any evidence that suggests they were undercounted. We had a 97% response rate for Census 2021. We used a number of admin data sets to check that people were both flowing in the right areas or staying in the right areas, health data, tax benefit records, even geospatial information. So no, I don't think so. And then, as I mentioned earlier, when we then produced our flow estimates over the decade, so independently corroborated the censuses to see the change and flow data taking away births and adding in births, taking away deaths, we came up with very, very comparable estimates. All this is published as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. I'll take 2 more questions that are shown on the screen. So the next one's from Colin. So there is no disembarkation control at UK ports and airports. Where do you get the data on who is leaving the UK?
Well, that depends on which nationality. So for British nationals, I mentioned it's hard to estimate a long-term emigrant for a British national because 250 million people move in and out of the country in a year, the vast majority of British nationals. So we use the International Passenger Survey. We sample a group of people at almost all ports and ask them what their intentions are. We ask if they intend to leave long term. So that tells us about British nationals. For EU nationals, we look at whether their behaviors in the country, i.e. if they stop contributing to tax or receiving benefits suddenly, we assume a proportion have emigrated, not all, of course, but we assume a proportion. Finally, for visa, for non-EU nationals, we do have pretty robust information, both in terms of immigration and emigration using advanced passenger information that we receive. So both coming in and out linked to their visas. So we know, indeed, of course, if they've overstayed, we know that information in terms of understanding who is a long-term migrant or not. So even if it's a short-term visa or many short-term visas added together, we can be confident that they've left linked to travel information.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. I'll take this as the final question. So what is the data set used for some of these analyses? Can we have a data scientist / tool set talk? So I'll jump in on this one to say we do have a few more technical webinars hosted by the ONS, but maybe Chris, if you want to talk about it from an ONS perspective, and then Ben, maybe this person might be interested in a bit more about what the Migration Observatory do.
Yes, I mean, because we hold a number of admin data sets, we use our data access platform. It's a secure research environment where analysts can access parts of the record. As I say, we don't disclose information on name or other information that's not needed. And then they use a number of tools to query the data. PySpark is what we use, which is like a sub-tool of Python. They use R. Some of the team use SAS to query some of the census data still. And indeed, you can query census data using what's called the flexible table builder, and you can look at really, really small geographies, for example, or groups or whatever for census. We're hoping to do things like that and make some of those tools more available in the future for the public. Yeah, I think that's about all I'd have to say right now for it.
Lovely. Thanks, Chris. Ben, did you want to say anything about getting in touch with the Migration Observatory?
Yeah, sure. I should say that the census data builder is brilliant. We absolutely love it. So yeah, do go and check that out. In terms of the analysis that we do, you can find everything on the Migration Observatory website. If you type it into Google, we should be the first result, I like to think. And we put the source that we used in all of the charts that we have, and we put any freedom information request data at the bottom of commentaries and things as well, so you can find that there. And most of what we do is using Excel, so it's relatively straightforward to do.
Yeah, Lovely. Thank you both. I'm going to leave it there for questions. Thank you so much for your thoughtful responses. Really excellent. So before we close, I'd just like to mention that we have a new podcast that's going out tomorrow. So this is part of our Statistically Speaking series, and it's called Migration, the Needle in the Data Haystack. So that will be available on all major podcast platforms from tomorrow. The next webinar in the series will be in September, and that is on GDP. So you can sign up scanning the QR code on screen or following us on Eventbrite. Before you go, we'd really appreciate if you could share how you found today's event. So this can be done on the Slido page that you've been using throughout the session. We'll also send you a link once the survey, once the webinar is finished, and you'll receive an email. But I'd just like to say again, thanks again to our presenters, and thank you to everyone joining today. We will catch you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye, everyone.